All right, so this brings us to a shift toward, a special lecturer. Oh, what do you have to say about Impressionism? Can you wave? Can you wave? No, he just woke up from a nap. So we got sleepy times. Oh. All right, so this leads to a movement towards Impressionism. Impressionism is a kind of style that you'll of course recognize because it's all over everything. This Monet painting gives us these kind of like harsh and intentional brushstrokes. You're seeing things that are focusing here on color and on light, a big movement away from realism. So Impressionism at its time was somewhat revolutionary. Oh, thank you. He clicked that for me. What a delightful helper. If realism sought to have a natural depiction of the world as it was, looking at things as a kind of photograph, then what the Impressionists did was they essentially found that entire claim somewhat specious. They said, if we're going to look at realism as truth, you need to recognize where all these things took place. They said this is a means of representing men under artificial conditions. So the realists would still put things into studios and they would bring in different kinds of lighting and they would create posturing and modeling and things that were intended to create a certain effect. This is suggestive that our perspective is always skewed, that we don't see things as they actually are. And so the Impressionists, taking their paintings outside, sought to capture other kinds of formal things like color and light as more important than making sure a model's face was exactly illuminated in a way that would look good in a painting. Instead, they sought to see things as they actually were to them. So Manet is really the first adventurer in this impressionistic journey. Faced a lot of rejection despite the fact that he was very reliant on old masters. He was a big fan of Velázquez and Goya, and we talked about Goya a lot. So we'll look at the left-hand side here, Goya's group on a balcony, as a good description for a contrast between Romantic art and this emerging movement of Impressionism. So Goya's painting, we get a sense of like the drama here, a kind of heroism, the lighting that's very distinct. You get like this brightness in the foreground and then these shadowy figures in the back, which creates something kind of menacing. But there's also like an unnatural element to the lighting here. So in the front, we get this... in the front, we get this light that doesn't really make sense. So you can't really have light that shines just on these women as it is, but not on the things behind it. We get a different sense of depth and perception than we do with Manet's painting. Manet's painting, we get a great sense of depth by these three characters. It's suggestive that the man is farther away from the woman in the foreground than the woman holding the umbrella. He faced some criticism though in his own time period because people thought the faces were too flat. They weren't as detailed and as real as they should look. But the idea for the Impressionists is that this is kind of how faces look when they're washed in light and in natural light out in the world. This is what a face looks like. You don't see the same kind of like descriptive nose that Goya's women have. Instead, you get something that feels a little bit blurred or a little rushed or a little hard to kind of specifically see, depending on the kind of light. Oh, you don't have to eat that. Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. Hey guys, I know we're doing different things now that we're doing learning from home. It's we've got other responsibilities, so I hope you don't mind the continued presence of just the best student that ever existed in the whole wide world. Okay, so moving into this next piece by Manet, we're starting to see some differences emerge. So just take a second to look at this. In English, it's called Luncheon on the Grass. On the grass? On the grass. As you look at this piece, obviously the naked woman stands out. She is alone in her nudity, surrounded by these aristocratically and modernly dressed Parisians. The look that she's giving us, as she's looking directly at us, is not a look of, there's no sexualized look that she's giving us. There's no defiance. There's no sense of shame or embarrassment that she's been caught unawares. In fact, if she wasn't nude, we would expect that this is just the face of somebody sizing us up and looking at us or almost inviting us to the conversation in a way that is just suggestive of people having a normal picnic. Her form is not idealized like Michelangelo's David, a statue we continue to refer to. There's something very natural and very real about how she's depicted here. We see another woman in the background kneeling by a stream, and this basket on the bottom left overturned with this woman's clothes bundled here as well. Now, this was scandalous for Parisians in the middle of the 19th century, despite the fact that this piece, painted just a little bit later, and pieces like it, were considered tremendously good art. This is Nymphs and Satyr. What's going on in this piece seems clearly more sexualized. There's more nudity. There are further women behind the main events, watching and waiting to join in. This satyr, a goat man, is indicative of sexual perversion, and this lover's tryst in the woods is depicted in a way that seems to be clearly sexual. But because it's mythological and because it seems like it's pulled out of a page of classic literature, that seems much less offensive and in some ways much less of a critique on society than this piece, where in the midst of fashionable Parisian society, there is this naked lady. Manet here is suggesting a contemporary vision of an older way of looking at things. This is the pastoral idyllic of lovers in the woods, maintaining this kind of like pagan frivolity. When he puts it here into Parisian society, it draws a big contrast between two different kinds of cultures, and his culture did not look favorably on it. This piece, however, became very quickly Manet's masterpiece, and it also caused problems, but it's also something that is clearly impressionistic. So as you're first looking at this piece, a couple things stand out, of course. The waitress here, bartender, is looking almost directly at us. She seems tired. She seems, what's her face? What kind of emotion can we read into her face? The things surrounding her seem to have almost more detail and more compulsion than she does. We're drawn to the flower in the middle of her dress. We're drawn to this flower, I think in particular, and the beauty of this glass with water in it, this bowl of oranges. Behind her, we see crowds of people, but without much detail. In fact, these couple perhaps get some slight details, but these ones in the back are just smudges, very much a difference from Funeral at Ornans, right, by Corray, in which we have each model sort of posed and a given face to each of the characters in the crowd. The more we look at this, though, we're sort of realizing by looking at this frame and really by looking at these bottles, as this bottle is reflected here, and this bottle is reflected here, and the tops of these champagne bottles are reflected here, that she's actually standing in front of a mirror, and what originally we might have thought was a crowd behind her is actually a crowd behind us. The viewpoint of the painter makes it so that this crowd is behind the painter or behind the viewer rather than behind the barmaid. That then gives us a weird kind of perspective because it seems like we're looking straight at her, but why then is her reflection to the side? Or is that her reflection, or is it somebody else's reflection? Are we intended to be a stand-in for this guy? Is he a customer at the bar? And if so, why is he all the way over there when he should be where we're standing? The perspective seems off, doesn't it? Not to mention all these smudges of people in this dirty mirror now that we're looking at it. It seems as though this glass and the still life is much more beautiful and much more realistically rendered than all these people in the background. This painting caused a stir because, again, it seemed like the perspective was wrong. It seemed like there were some kind of problems. But what Manet is doing, and this is really well described in this diagram by Park, is that he's playing with the camera. So this diagram suggests that the viewpoint is actually here, and the camera is tilted towards the barmaid, who is looking directly at us, but from an angle, making then the person who is ordering a drink not facing her at all, but facing away from her. In the background, then, we see the two of them together because of the angle of the camera. We have then as well a problem that they found was, well, where does this end, right? She's standing here and the counter is off. The counter ends right here, and what we have really is like an illusion, a trick of our senses, because we're expecting to be looking at this through a particular lens, when in fact that lens has deceived us. Now, this is a common trick. These are old tricks. Big fan of Lord of the Rings. So in the Fellowship of the Ring, the movies, I like the books also, but the movies, they had to do this constant thing where the character who played Gandalf, Ian McKellen, is supposed to be like 3 times the size of Elijah Wood's Frodo Baggins. Frodo's a hobbit, so he's supposed to be really small, and Gandalf's supposed to be really big. Well, how do you make that happen? And what they did was crazy. They had stand-ins for each of the hobbits who were little people, and they made face masks of each of the characters and put them on these players to stand in occasionally. But they also took advantage of old camera tricks where Ian McKellen would sit forward and Elijah Wood would sit backward, and they would look like they were looking at each other. And all of a sudden, these things that are obviously the same size because of this perspective are a little bit off. And if you move it a certain way, you could create a space where the two of them seem to line up together, and one seemed to be much smaller than the other one. These kinds of old-fashioned camera tricks are something that Manet plays with. And this is particularly interesting because photography has just started to be a thing. And realists are saying, hey, this supports our vision, which is that we're capturing reality as it is. And Manet says, well, yeah, but the camera plays tricks too. And he's pointing it out in this painting, which is a really amazing and kind of awesome illusion that also undermines the claims of the realists.